Hulagu Khan was not a sudden event in history. Before Baghdad was besieged, and before the Abbasid Caliphate fell, there was one man who changed the meaning of power forever: Genghis Khan. Genghis left behind not just an empire. He left behind an unwritten law: he who does not submit is wiped out. And after his death, the project did not end. It was passed down through the blood, from father to son, and from grandson to grandson. And so Hulagu Khan was born, not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as an instrument to carry out the will of an empire that was long overdue. When Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes at the beginning of the 13th century, he was not establishing an ordinary state, but laying the foundation for a system of unstoppable expansion, an empire based not on religion, nor on lineage, but on absolute obedience and military might. And after Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the empire did not disintegrate. Rather, it was functionally divided among his sons, while the goal remained the same: expansion. This is a point many overlook. The Mongols did not inherit the land, but rather the mission. Transfer of power from Ogday to Monk Khan. After Genghis Khan, his sons and grandsons succeeded him. But the real transformation came with Monk Khan, the Great Khan. Monk Khan ruled from 1251 to 1259. He was a strict administrator. He recentralized decision-making. He decided that the empire could not be governed without the removal of rival symbolic powers, especially in the Islamic world. And here the name of Hulagu Khan appears: the division of the empire among his sons, and the continuation of the expansionist project. No collapse, no power vacuum. And here is a crucial point. Death did not stop expansion, but rather organized it. Between 1229 and 1241, Ogday Khan consolidated the institutions of the empire. Expansion into China and Europe. The Islamic East was not the primary objective. Hulagu Khan, the Great Khan, recentralized decision-making. By identifying the major adversaries, he realized that the Abbasid Caliphate represented symbolic legitimacy, a future political threat.
Hulagu Khan was born around 1217, the son of Tului, son of Genghis Khan. His mother was Surgatani Beki, a pivotal figure. Lineage here is not a trivial detail. Hulagu was born at the heart of power, not on its margins. Second, the mother, the most critical factor: Surgatani Beki, a Nestorian Christian, exceptionally politically astute. She maintained her son's influence after her husband's death. Her sons: Hulagu Khan, later the Great Khan; Kublai Khan, founder of the Yuan dynasty in China; Erik Buka. Hulagu Khan, this woman, created a generation of rulers, not just warriors. Hulagu did not have an innocent childhood. He grew up in Mongol camps. From a young age, he learned horse riding, armor, military discipline. He heard stories of conquests that were almost legendary. He was raised on the idea that power is seized, not given. Genghis Khan's sons were not raised as savages. Rather, they were exposed to administration. They learned how to deal with different ethnicities. They witnessed negotiations and punishments. Hulagu grew up seeing how an empire was run, how the submissive were rewarded, and how the dissenters were annihilated. Hulagu was not a Muslim. He was influenced by the Nestorian Christian environment through his mother. But he was not a religious fanatic. In his childhood, religion was a means of alliance, not a doctrine of war. To put it more precisely, Hulagu was not raised to be a hero, nor a monster, but to be an instrument in an imperial project. He began before he learned to speak. After Genghis Khan's death, Hulagu was still young.
Baghdad
he was not pushed directly
didn't
to the
fall
forefront.
because Hulagu was unstoppable.
Thrown into major
It
wars
fell
as an
because
independent
power
commander.
believed its
And
name
here's
was
an important
enough.
point.
When a
Hulagu was not
civilization
the first
starts
heir,
worshipping
but the
its
strategic
past,
reserve.
it stops
His
preparing
brothers
for
were
the future.
Hulagu Khan, the strict
Hulagu
administrator;
wasn't chaos.
Kublai Khan, the
He was a
ambitious
test.
politician;
And Baghdad
Erik Buka, later an
failed
internal
it.
rival. Hulagu learned in the shadows. He participated in limited campaigns. He observed Mongol tactics, swift strikes, psychological warfare, sieges, not just confrontations. He learned to work within a command structure, not as a lone leader. This period explains why he was later an executor, not an adventurer. With Hulagu Khan's rise to power, Hulagu also rose to power. In 1251, Hulagu Khan became the Great Khan, and so began the era of internal purges. Rival factions were eliminated. Here, Hulagu's position changed, from a Mongol prince to a central instrument of governance. The question is, why was Hulagu granted this power? Because Hulagu Khan needed a leader who wouldn't challenge him for the throne, but who was capable of executing massive tasks. He owed familial and political allegiance. Hulagu was from the same mother, not ambitious for the supreme throne, suitable for a geographically distant mission. The authority granted to him was not rule, but rather an open mandate by force. 1253. In this year, Hulagu received his true power. The mandate included commanding a massive army, military and administrative powers, freedom to form alliances, the power to decide on war or annihilation. But no complete political independence, direct subordination to Hulagu Khan. Hulagu was not yet a king, he was a delegated field governor. After the fall of Baghdad 1258, and the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate, Hulagu transformed from a campaign leader to the founder of a regional power, and from here began the Ilkhanate. The ascension to power was gradual, not a sudden official declaration. That is to say, Hulagu did not rise to power because he was the strongest, but because he was the most suitable to carry out what no one else wanted to bear the consequences of.
Hulagu's first mission was the point at which he transformed from a Mongol prince into the leader of a destructive ruling project. In 1251, when Hulagu Khan became the Great Khan, the empire was suffering from rebellious fortresses, independent religious forces, a constant threat to trade routes. The most dangerous of these forces were the Ismailis, the Nizari Ismailis, the assassins. Why was this his first mission? Because the Ismailis were entrenched in mountain fortresses, the most important being Alamut, relied on political assassinations, were not subject to any central authority, pose a threat even to the Mongols themselves. For Hulagu Khan, an empire could not be built while its leaders were being assassinated in secret. Hulagu's first clear order was not Baghdad. Rather, it was the elimination of the Ismailis in Persia and their fortresses. He was given a massive army, Chinese siege engineers, absolute military authority, and here his true character begins to emerge. He began carrying out the mission between the years 1253 and 1256. Phase 1. Systematic advancement. He did not attack directly. He cut off supply lines. He psychologically terrorized the fortresses. He negotiated, then struck. Phase 2. The fall of the fortresses. Major fortresses fell one after another. Alamut fell in 1256. The Imam Rukn al-Din Kersha was arrested. The Ismaili state effectively came to an end. Important point: it was not a single battle, but a complete campaign of cleansing. What did Hulagu learn from his first mission? A siege is longer, but more successful. Terror shortens the time. Eliminating the symbol is more important than killing soldiers. These lessons would later be applied in Baghdad. After the fall of Alamut, no one in the Islamic East was unaware of the meaning of defiance. Only one symbol remained: Baghdad. Why was this mission pivotal? Hulagu proved himself as an executive commander. He solidified his trust in Hulagu Khan. He opened the geographical and political path to Iraq. Without this mission, neither Baghdad nor the Caliphate would fall. Before Hulagu marched on Baghdad, there was a small entity, but more dangerous than entire armies. The assassins Nizari Ismailis, an independent religious political organization that relied on precise assassinations, psychological terror, They didn't confront armies, but rather assassinated leaders. They killed sultans, ministers, and princes. For the Mongols, an enemy that could not be subdued by conventional warfare, Hulagu decided to eliminate them. For three clear reasons. Because they threatened the Mongol leaders themselves. They controlled strategic routes, and they refused to submit to any authority. Hulagu Khan understood the equation. No empire, with knives in the shadows. The campaign against the assassins began in 1253. When Hulagu moved, he didn't come for revenge, but to end an idea. A massive army, engineers of siege, a long-term plan. He didn't attack Alamut directly. Rather, the strategy of dismantling before besieging was employed by Hulagu. He captured the smaller fortresses first. He severed communication between the fortresses. He used threats and conditional surrender. He spread terror before the swords. This was not random brutality, but calculated psychological warfare. Alamut Castle. Alamut is a mountain fortress in northern Persia, modern-day Iran. Its name means eagle's nest. It was built on a very rugged peak. Access was difficult, and a direct attack was almost impossible. Alamut was not just a fortress, but a mental and organizational capital. Why was Alamut dangerous? Because the assassins were not a large army, nor an expansionist state, but rather a network of assassinations. Psychological warfare, a constant threat to the ruling elites. Among the most important characteristics of their strength were killing the leader instead of confronting the army, sowing fear instead of winning battles, complete independence from any authority. This type of adversary cannot be defeated in battle. So, did Hulagu decide to destroy Alamut? The reasons weren't solely religious, but purely imperial. The assassins had previously killed and terrorized powerful leaders. Their very existence threatened the Mongol leaders. They controlled strategic passes. They refused to submit or pay tribute. Hulagu Khan's decision was clear. A global empire could not coexist with a shadowy organization. In 1256, he besieged Alamut, the fortress that was said to be unconquerable. It fell without a major battle. What happened? A relatively long siege, constant psychological pressure, lack of supplies, internal divisions. Imam Rukn al-Din Kursha realized the impossibility of resistance, surrendered on terms, and left the fortress. After the fall of Alamut, here is the point that changed everything. Hulagu ordered the destruction of the fortress, the burning of the archives and libraries, the killing or dispersal of the leadership, the end of the symbol, not just the place. The goal was not to control Alamut, but to erase the idea it represented. And here we ask, what did the world lose with the fall of Alamut? We say, philosophical and religious texts were lost. A unique organizational archive was lost. An unconventional political experiment came to an end. But it wasn't a scientific library, the size of the House of Wisdom. It wasn't a center of enlightenment in the modern sense. Alamut was more important than Baghdad. And for one reason. Alamut shows how Hulagu thinks. Baghdad shows what he does when he decides. Alamut means testing the model. Baghdad means the final application. At Alamut, Hulagu learned how to destroy an idea. In Baghdad, he decided to destroy an entire world. With the fall of Alamut in 1256, Hulagu's campaign did not end, but rather began its most dangerous phase. The fortresses fell. The secret organization was dismantled, and the road was open. There was no longer anyone in the Islamic East who held a knife in the shadows, nor a fortress in the mountains. Only one thing remained, the symbol. Baghdad was not a fortress, nor an army. It was an idea, the idea that the Caliphate still ruled, even when it was incapable of defending itself. And so began the Baghdad ultimatum, the psychological phase. Before the army moved, the messages began to flow. Hulagu sent to the Abbasid Caliph, demanding his submission. the dismantling of the fortifications, the dispatch of funds and soldiers, and recognition of Mongol sovereignty. The message was clear in its meaning: either obedience or annihilation. This is the text of Hulagu's ultimatum to the Abbasid Caliph 1257–1258. From Hulagu Khan, agent of the Great Khan, to the Caliph of Baghdad: you know what we did to those who disobeyed our command, and what befell the fortresses that closed their gates against us. We do not seek war, but we do not fear it. If you obey, you will be safe in yourself and your land, and you will retain your name and position. But if you disobey, blame no one but yourself. For the armies that brought down mountains will bring down your city, and not one stone will be left upon another. Choose for yourself, before we choose for you. The ultimatum was not symbolic, but a practical political one, and it included clear demands: recognition of Mongol sovereignty, dismantling the fortifications of Baghdad, sending money and soldiers, ceasing to play the role of the ruling caliphate, remaining as a religious symbol without real power. In other words, the caliphate remains in name, and loses all decision-making power. How did Hulagu understand the relationship? Hulagu did not see the caliph as an independent king, nor a military leader. Rather, he saw him as an outdated symbol refused to acknowledge that times had changed. This explains the tone of the message: not negotiating, not emotional, but a final administrative warning. This was Caliph al-Mustasim Billah's response to Hulagu's warning. From Abdullah, commander of the faithful, successor of the messenger of God, to Hulagu Khan: Baghdad is the seat of the caliphate, the home of scholars, and a refuge for Muslims from the east and west. We have received your letter, and we are certain that God protects its sanctity, and grants victory to those who seek refuge with him. If you seek peace, we are people of peace. If you seek war, for every matter there is a decree, and we remind you that whoever attacks the caliphate will not escape the consequences, and that Baghdad is not like other cities. Peace be upon those who follow guidance. The caliph did not understand the message. He did not prepare an army. He did not build an alliance. He did not treat the threat as a reality. He treated it as a message that could be ignored. This is not courage. This is a misreading of history. After Alamut, Baghdad had only one choice: to acknowledge that times had changed, but it chose to pretend that nothing had happened. The response wasn't an outright refusal, but it was worse. The caliph didn't say yes, nor did he say no. Instead, he said something far more dangerous: we are protected by symbol, not by force. In the Mongol mind, ambiguity means rejection. Reminding of status means provocation. Relying on the sanctity of Baghdad was a strategic illusion. The caliph based his response on the idea that Baghdad was inviolable, that the caliph could not be killed, that the Mongols would take religious symbolism into account. This was a fatal mistake. The Mongols brought down the Abbasid Caliphate in Samarkand. Before that, they destroyed older and holiest cities. They recognized only force or submission. The phrase, "if you seek war," was a reckless declaration of defiance. This particular phrase was interpreted by the Mongols as, "we do not fear you," while the reality was, no organized army, no modernized fortifications, no real allies. This is not courage. This is a miscalculation of the balance of power. The caliph offered no practical concessions. Note what was omitted from the reply: no recognition of Hulagu's sovereignty, no offer to dismantle the walls, no hostage sending, no serious negotiating delegation. And this is precisely what led to the decision. The siege was inevitable. How did Hulagu interpret this reply? According to Mongol logic, the caliph was betting on time, or on a miracle, or on the illusion of prestige. The result: Baghdad chose to be tested by force. The caliph's response was not a declaration of war but rather a declaration of impotence, wrapped in a confidence he lacked the means to back up. Was there an alternative? Yes. Historically, many cities have submitted. It survived in part. It preserved its elite, and its destruction was postponed for years. Surrender was not an honor, nor was resistance a disgrace, but denial was a political crime. This name is essential in these events. Who was Ibn al-Alqami? Mu'ayyid al-Din Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn al-Alqami, the minister of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim Billah, a Shia, an educated administrator, not a military leader. He assumed the ministry during a period of decline, and one of the founders of the Abbasid state. Here's a crucial point. Ibn al-Alqami was not the ultimate decision-maker, but rather an advisor in a weak court. The common accusation against him: did he betray Baghdad? Popular narrative says, he secretly corresponded with Hulagu. He persuaded the caliph to reduce the size of the army. He facilitated the Mongol invasion. And he surrendered Baghdad. This narrative is widespread, but it is not supported by conclusive documents. What do reliable sources actually confirm? The issue of army reduction. Yes, the army was reduced in size. But the army was already weak. Irregular pay. Disloyalty was fragmented. Some sources mention that the number was already inflated. To place the entire blame on Ibn al-Alqami here is to ignore the corruption within the military establishment itself. Did he communicate with Hulagu? There is no documented text of a letter in Ibn al-Alqami's own handwriting. Nor is there any explicit mention of the siege by contemporary historians such as Ibn al-Ibri. Most of the accusations appeared later in sectarian political sources. History is not built on hearsay. His true role, a peace advisor at a critical juncture. Ibn al-Alqami was pushing to avoid confrontation, believing that Baghdad could not withstand the siege, between a belated political solution. The problem: he accurately assessed the Mongols' strength, but he misjudged the Mongols' mentality. Ibn al-Alqami's real mistake, and here we are being fair, was not treason, but rather believing that rationality works with an uncompromising power, working within a collapsing system without any executive authority, continuing to advise after he had become ineffective. This is not evil, this is a misreading of reality. Where was the caliph? And here's the question that isn't asked enough. Why was one minister able to exert such influence? Where was the war council? Where were the commanders? Where was the central decision-making? The existence of a scapegoat conceals that the state fell because no one was leading it. Ibn al-Alqami didn't bring down Baghdad, but he was the last man trying to save a state that no longer believed it needed saving. And the question is, did Ibn al-Alqami benefit after the fall? We say he was appointed administrator for a short time. He died a few months later. He didn't establish a government. He didn't gain lasting influence. A true traitor usually lives long. Ibn al-Alqami didn't. A stark conclusion without mincing words. Yes, he made mistakes. Yes, he was politically naive. No, he wasn't the architect of the fall. To place all the blame on him is to evade the truth. The beginning of the siege of Baghdad, the decision was made before the army moved. The common misconception is that the siege began at the walls of Baghdad. The harsh truth: Baghdad fell the day the decision was made in Karakoram. Hulagu Khan, the great Khan, tasked Hulagu with two clear missions: to eliminate the assassins, and to subdue Baghdad completely. Baghdad was not a potential target, but rather a target included in the grand plan. And the army's movement, not a march, but an engineering operation. Hulagu's army did not move in a traditional invasion, but rather in a clever encirclement operation. Forces comprised of Mongols, Turks, Chinese siege specialists, Christians, Armenians, Georgians, engineers, floating bridge units, heavy artillery units, Chinese catapults. This means one thing: There was no scenario for a Mongol withdrawal. The plan: to isolate Baghdad before touching it. Before the people of Baghdad even saw a single Mongol, the following had already occurred. Control of the roads, cutting off supply lines, neutralizing the surrounding cities, spreading deliberate terror to paralyze psychological resistance. This means Baghdad wasn't simply besieged, it was strangled. The silent catastrophe was the first military engagement. The Caliph sent a small force led by the little Dawidar, one of the court commanders. What happened? The troops set out without reconnaissance. They fell into a Mongol ambush. They were almost completely annihilated. This moment is crucial, because it revealed to the Mongols that Baghdad lacked a true field command. Consider the delay in decisions. While the Mongols were crossing the Tigris, the Caliph was still hesitant. Meanwhile, Hulagu builded pontoon bridges, deployed his forces east and west of Baghdad, completed the siege. The Caliph: no general mobilization, no defensive plan, no unified command. The real siege began here, when Baghdad was surrounded, and no one was leading it from within. The truth is, Baghdad was alone at this stage. No allies, no reinforcements, no miracle, and the Mongols had time, had numbers, had experience, and Baghdad had only history. And history cannot stop catapults. The tragedy of Baghdad did not begin at the walls, but when an army moved that knew exactly what it wanted, towards a city that did not know what to do. The mangonels, the weapon that decided the battle before the walls were breached. First, why were the mangonels decisive in the first place? Baghdad did not fall because of the sheer number of soldiers. Rather, because its walls were old and outdated. They were built for a conventional enemy, not for an army possessing siege techniques that transcended civilizations. The Mongols did not invent the mangonel, but they did something far more dangerous. They transformed it into a systematic, industrially engineered system. The counterweight mangonel, trebuchet, is the most dangerous siege weapon. It does not rely on manpower. Instead, it relies on an enormous weight that drops the arm with consistent force. The result: greater accuracy, greater penetrating power, and the systematic destruction of the walls. This type of mangonel opened the first breaches. As for the Chinese mangonel Weiwei Pao, it was brought by Chinese engineers with the Mongol army. It was technologically advanced compared to Islamic models. Its advantages: speed of reloading, the ability to hurl huge stones, primitive incendiary projectiles, incendiary materials. Here began the psychological bombardment, not just the physical. Human catapults, however, were older and weaker. They relied on pulling ropes, less accurate in hitting the target. They were used against towers, to exhaust defenders, to intensify fire, meaning they weren't decisive on their own, but they were part of the fire saturation. How were the catapults set up? Here is where Mongol ingenuity shines. They were set up on the east and west banks of the Tigris. Earth platforms were built, wooden barricades were erected for protection. The firing points were predetermined. The bombardment wasn't random, but rather a calculated, geometrically precise attack. What were they hurled? Not just stones, huge stone blocks, incendiary devices, naft, flammable materials. Sometimes, the bodies of the dead to terrorize and break morale. This is a well-known tactic in the Mongol sieges, and it is documented in more than one city. As for the impact of the catapults on Baghdad, materially, the collapse of parts of the wall, the destruction of towers, the paralysis of defenses, psychologically, constant noise, nightly terror, and most importantly, a feeling of complete helplessness. Many defenders fled before the assault, and Baghdad's fatal mistake: no effective counter-catapults, no sorties to destroy the machinery, no military engineering command. To be more precise, The city was being bombarded, and didn't know how to respond. Baghdad was not conquered by swords, but by a science it didn't understand, and by machines it hadn't prepared for. When and why did the wall collapse? The collapse of the wall was not sudden, nor was it a single blow. The bombardment continued for days. The same points. They were repeatedly targeted, and the Abbasid walls, built of reinforced mud, not designed to withstand counterweight projectiles. And the Mongols understood a simple rule. A wall is not broken by force, but by consistent wear and tear. Second, the moment of collapse, the decisive breach. One of the defensive towers partially collapsed, and a widening breach was formed. The catapults did not stop, and the Mongol infantry began to close in. Here the psychological shift occurred. The defenders realized that the wall was no longer a barrier, but a trap. Third, why wasn't the breach sealed? In traditional sieges, battles are built behind the wall. Internal trenches are dug, counterattacks are launched. In Baghdad, no organization, no clear orders, no field command. The result, some soldiers deserted, others surrendered. The defensive line completely collapsed. More precisely, the city was not only breached, but also lost its will to defend itself. Fourth, the assault. How did the Mongols enter? The assault was not a chaotic rush. Select forces entered first. They secured the breach. They widened the opening. They brought in additional units. They took control of vital points. No immediate mass looting. No indiscriminate killing at the outset. The objective was control, not chaos. Fifth, what was the caliph's position? Here is the crucial point. After the wall collapsed, any resistance became militarily meaningless. The caliph chose to send a delegation, to request safe passage, to surrender belatedly. The problem, the surrender came after its negotiating value had expired. Sixth, why did the assault turn into a disaster? Because the Mongols operated on the logic, a city that resists and then surrenders is punished. A city that surrenders before a fight is governed. Baghdad didn't surrender early, and it didn't defend itself effectively. So it met its worst fate. When the wall collapsed, it wasn't just the armies that entered, a new logic entered. A logic with no room for symbols. The Baghdad Massacre. The Baghdad Massacre was not a moment of anger. Rather, it was a calculated punishment. In a logic that recognizes no symbols. If a covenant is broken, when did the massacre begin? A crucial point where many err. The massacre did not begin immediately with the storming, but rather after the official surrender, and after the collapse of the wall, and after the departure of the caliph and the notables of Baghdad, and after the issuance of initial orders of safe passage for certain groups. And it was precisely here that the explosion occurred. Why did the massacre happen despite the surrender? The reason is not merely brutality, but a clear Mongol logic. Baghdad resisted and then surrendered. Mongol soldiers fell during the siege. Individual attacks occurred from within the city after the declaration of safe passage. The Mongols considered this a breach of the covenant and military treason. In the Mongol mind, a covenant is sacred, and breaking it is met with annihilation. How was the massacre carried out? The city was divided into sectors. Each unit was responsible for a specific area. The killings were organized, temporarily limited to several days. Not entirely random. This doesn't lessen the crime, but it undermines the image of anarchic madness. Who was targeted? Here, precision is crucial. Those targeted most heavily were soldiers, administrators, those who took up arms, those who attempted resistance after surrendering. Those who escaped relatively unscathed were some scholars, some artisans, those who sought refuge in monasteries or embassies, especially Christian ones, those for whom ransoms were paid. The massacre wasn't a case of killing everyone without exception, but it was widespread and horrific. The true number of victims. Figures mentioned: 200,000, 400,000, even a million. These figures are demographically unreliable. More recent estimates: tens of thousands and perhaps more, but Baghdad was never a city of millions in that sense. The exaggeration came later for reasons of doctrinal, political, emotional. A tragedy doesn't need a mythical number to be a tragedy. Hulagu entered Baghdad after the main fighting had ended. The city was partially destroyed and silent, without organized resistance. The entry was not a ceremonial display. Rather, it was an administrative inspection of a subjugated city. And this is important, because Hulagu did not come to celebrate, but to demonstrate that the decision had been carried out. He summoned the caliph. From absolute symbol to prisoner, Caliph al-Mustasim came out with his sons and the dignitaries of the state. He was asking for safety, preservation of life, and the continuation of the caliphate as a symbol. But in the balance of power, the symbol was gone, because the decision had already been made. Here, the summons was not a negotiation, but a final act. Why was the caliph killed? Don't just answer, because they were monsters. That's a lazy answer. The real reasons. The caliph was a sovereign symbol. His survival meant a potential center of legitimacy. And he had originally rejected the ultimatum. In the Mongol logic, a breach of obedience, a policy of preventing rebellion. No head should be left around which people could rally. This is the logic of an expansionist state. No emotional reaction. Sources differ in the details, but agree in essence. The caliph's blood was not spilled directly. The most famous account states, he was wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses. This stems from an ancient Mongol belief that the blood of the king should not be spilled on the ground. What about his sons? Most of them were killed. Some women were spared. The political line of the caliphate in Baghdad came to an end. And here the Abbasid Caliphate ended, as a ruling power, not as a religious idea. And the great moment of silence after the caliph's assassination. No declaration, no statement, no sermon. The city understood the message, that the era was over, and the true meaning of the caliph's assassination. It wasn't just an insult to Islam. Rather, the end of a 500-year-old political system, the shift of the center of the Islamic world, and the beginning of a new era. Cairo, Damascus, and later, the Ottomans. Civilizations don't die, but capitals do. And with the assassination of the caliph, an entire chapter of world history closed. And here we pose a very important question. Was Baghdad really burned? The answer is yes, but not in the way it is usually told. The city wasn't burned all at once. It didn't turn into a sea of fire. It wasn't a single act. They burned everything. What happened was the systematic destruction of specific centers, following chaotic fires, and a complete administrative collapse. What exactly was burned? Palaces and official institutions were burned. The caliph's residence, the government offices, arms depots, symbols of Abbasid authority. This was politically motivated, meaning the erasure of any trace of the previous regime. Neighborhoods that had resisted were burned. Areas where attacks occurred after the surrender. Some neighborhoods where Mongol soldiers were killed. In the Mongol logic, punishment is collective, and an example to be set. Libraries were burned. Yes, they were destroyed. Priceless books were lost. But not all the world's libraries were burned. Not all knowledge was thrown into the Tigris. The phrase, "the river turned black with ink," is rhetorical, not literal. Many books were looted, were moved, were later lost in the ensuing chaos. The question is, was burning a general Mongol policy? The answer is no. The Mongols were not enemies of knowledge. On the contrary, they employed scholars. They preserved other centers of learning. Maragay, for example, Baghdad was burned because it was a former center of rebellion, a symbol of sovereignty, and because it was a city that defied the ultimatum. What remained of Baghdad? The city did not disappear, but it lost its role, lost its inhabitants, lost its global standing. It was transformed from the capital of the world into a devastated regional city. The most devastating blow was not the fire, nor the killing. Rather, the continuity of civilization was shattered. Scholars were scattered. Schools were closed. Baghdad was no longer a center of attraction. Civilization does not die, but when its networks are severed, it weakens for decades. And here is the conclusion. Baghdad was not burned because the Mongols hated knowledge, but because it was a state without a state. So the city fell, and with it, the center of the world fell. How does the greatest city in the world fall? Without being betrayed by a single enemy, but rather when it betrays itself. After Baghdad, what was Hulagu's true plan? After 1258, Hulagu did not change his plan, but moved to the next stage of Hulagu Khan's order. The subjugation of the entire Islamic East, up to the borders of Egypt. Baghdad was the political juncture, not the ultimate goal. The next stage was the advance towards Syria. We begin with the fall of Aleppo in 1259–1260. Aleppo fell quickly, with limited resistance and partial destruction. This was a clear message to the rest of Syria. Then came the entry into Damascus. Damascus surrendered without a fight, thus escaping the bloody fate of Baghdad. Local administration was relatively preserved. This underscores a crucial point. The Mongols destroy those who resist and govern those who surrender. The ultimate goal was Egypt, not Jerusalem, because it was the last Islamic military power, the center of the Mamluks, and a trade hub. Had Egypt fallen, the entire Levant would have fallen. Herein lies a very important question. Why didn't Hulagu continue the campaign himself? And here is the pivotal moment. The death of Hulagu Khan in 1259, the Great Khan. All the bloodthirsty princes were obligated to return or wait, due to the succession struggle. As for Hulagu, he withdrew with a large part of the army, leaving the command of Syria behind to his deputy, Kitbuga. The Battle of Ain Jalut, the first Mongol defeat. Commander Kitbuga faced the Mamluks without full support and without his main army. The result, a crushing defeat for the Mongols. It was their first real defeat in an open battle. Thus, the advance towards Egypt was halted. The Battle of Ain Jalut did not defeat Hulagu, but it did defeat his westward expansionist project. The question is, where did Hulagu turn next? After Ain Jalut, his focus returned to consolidating his rule in Iraq and Iran. He established the Ilkhanate. He founded a capital in Maragay. He established the Maragay Observatory and a relatively stable administration. This is very important. The man who destroyed Baghdad later built one of the most important scientific institutions of the 13th century. The true meaning of what came after Baghdad was not a retreat, nor was it regret. Rather, it was a change of priorities and political necessity. And the limits imposed by reality mean that Hulagu did not stop because he was satiated with conquest, but rather because history presented him with two enemies simultaneously, the Mamluks and the descendants of Genghis Khan. Here we ask, why didn't Hulagu return to Baghdad? For purely strategic reasons. Baghdad was a fallen symbol. It was a broken city, and unsuitable as a new capital. Persia, on the other hand, was more stable, and closer to trade routes, and less prone to rebellion. Hulagu was neither emotional nor symbolic. He chose a location that served the state, not history. What was Hulagu doing at this stage? He consolidated his rule. He organized taxes. He appointed governors, and reopened trade routes. Here we mention the internal Mongol conflict. Hulagu entered into direct conflict with Berke Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde. This is considered the first real Mongol civil war, and this conflict was more important than the Battle of Ain Jalut in the long run. Hulagu attempted to recapture the Levant, but he no longer had the same momentum, nor the same focus, because circumstances had changed. The Mamluks had become powerful, and the Mongol Empire was divided. Hulagu's attempts were limited and inconclusive. The most significant transformation, the end of the pagan Mongols. In his later years, Hulagu remained nominally a Buddhist, shamanist, but he opened the door for the spread of Islam. His sons and grandsons later converted to Islam. The fall of Baghdad did not end Islam. Rather, it began a phase of Islamization among the Mongols themselves. Hulagu's death. He died in 1265 CE in Iran after he destroyed a capital city, builded a state, and ushered in a new era. After Hulagu conquered Baghdad, he was no longer a conqueror seeking a city, but a ruler seeking stability, even on the ruins of an entire world. The stark conclusion: Hulagu after Baghdad, he was not defeated nor did he suffer a moral decline. Rather, he changed his role from campaign leader to founder of a state. Whoever doesn't understand this point will not understand why his influence continued. Even after his death, Hulagu was not the most bloodthirsty of the Mongol leaders, nor was he the least intelligent. He was a product of Genghis Khan's school, a school that doesn't ask who you are, but whether you obey or be annihilated. He brought down the Abbasid Caliphate, not because he hated Islam, but because he didn't recognize any authority that couldn't defend itself. He entered history through the gates of Baghdad, but he didn't live there. He left it behind, a broken symbol, and headed to Persia to build a state, establish a government, and nurture knowledge. The capitals that claimed his immortality couldn't protect him. And here lies the cruel irony. The man who ended an entire era was not the end of history, but the beginning of a new one. Hulagu was not merely a destroyer, nor a conquering hero, but a mirror. A mirror of a state that had lost its ability to act, and of a world that has no mercy on those who live only on its past glories. Hulagu did not conquer Baghdad alone, but he was the man who officially declared that times had changed, and whoever did not change with him would be crushed beneath him.